Really looking forward to sharing some of the research with you all today and then having a terrific conversation with our panelists. So, looking forward to it. So with that, at Castle, we always start with an inclusive welcome. And so in order to kind of prime us and get into that headspace of our conversation today, I did want to just share a question for everyone. So thinking about some of the ways that you have seen social emotional learning integrated into classroom spaces. What happened? What was that like? And what did the environment feel like? So we are going to just take a moment to reflect, maybe jot down some notes for yourself, so you can have that with you as we dialogue. About 30 seconds. I know that's quick, but hopefully you were able to spark a little bit there. We are going to go ahead and dive right in then to our conversation. So really wanted to kick us off with sharing some of the research framing for everyone. So we have a large body of research that has demonstrated the effectiveness of SEL programming for supporting students, and most of this research has focused on universal school-based interventions. And what that means is that it's provided to all students and it's to support the development of their intra and interpersonal competencies. And so um, it's an absolute, kind of robust research background. However, some have adopted kind of a narrow definition of what SEL programming can look like in terms of implementing SEL as a standalone, separate program that is not necessarily integrated throughout the whole day. So at Castle, we use the 10 indicators of school-wide SEL to talk about what it looks like and feels like in a school when SEL truly is implemented systemically. And so when thinking about this, we see the integration of SEL practices into academic instruction by really weaving deep academic learning with opportunities for students to understand their own emotions, empathize with diverse perspectives, cultivate trusting relationships with peers and teachers, solve problems constructively, and really make decisions while considering the needs of others, right? So what's important to call out here is that when SEL is truly incorporated into content area classrooms, it not only serves students at an individual level in allowing them the opportunity to learn and practice their own SEL skills when engaging in coursework, but the integration component also creates this overall set of learning conditions for all students in a classroom to really feel safe in asking questions, make and learn from mistakes in the classroom, and constructively engage with each other in interactive group work. So, in a time when the phrase academic recovery is very much centered in our nation's dialogue in the education field, what we're offering is the integration of SEL into academic instruction as a research-based way to offer, right, offer students access, right, to really high quality, rigorous academic content. So today, have absolute honor and privilege to have a conversation with Dr. Sarah Rim-Kaufman and Dr. Joe Pullman, and hearing their perspectives and their research and insights into what this looks like, not only in the research community, but also, of course, in classrooms with whom they're working. So just in terms of a backdrop here, in terms of the research, so social emotional learning, there's going to be a running theme throughout our time together, really does pair well, right, with academic instruction. And so research shows that SEL is critical to supporting, again, not only academic recovery, but growth. So SEL really does promote these development of skills, right, that I mentioned a moment ago. So, including the idea of goal setting, constructive problem solving, self management skills, responsible decision making, and motivation. And that those really positively impact students' academic achievement. We have seen that in a variety of studies. And independent studies have shown that SEL can be a powerful tool for boosting achievement. So I just wanted to call out a couple of really prominent pieces. So first, we saw the positive impact on academic achievement being consistent across studies in a variety of meta-analyses, but a 2022 meta-analysis that involved over 500 studies and about 1 million students it found that universal school-based SEL programs across that span, early childhood to high school, they do have consistent and positive impacts on student academic achievement and student attitudes. And then on top of that, we see that these impacts do kind of withstand, right, the test of time. So there was an 2017 meta-analysis as well. That included over 80 studies and over 100,000 students worldwide, and really showing that the follow-up studies conducted years after students participated in the interventions, it found that their academic performance was on average 13 percentile points higher than those students who didn't participate. So there very much has been such a robust foundational research agenda built to really back social emotional learning programming and intervention efforts as kind of proof points, right, in terms of why it works and why it matters to students' academic achievement and lifelong success. So with that, we really try to think about an analogy using a three-legged stool for high quality SEL in classrooms. And we see this showing up in three primary ways. So the first is through this idea of building a supportive environment, right? So coming from practices and routines that build really strong relationships, again, teacher and student relationships, peer-to-peer relationships and interactions, relational trust and belonging in the classroom. We also know a great deal about explicit SEL instruction and how, even given the research I just shared, how pivotal it is to high quality SEL implementation. So this is where the instructor and students use time specifically, right, to discuss and learn about social and emotional competencies and how they use them. And then that third leg of the stool there is the integration of SEL and instruction. And that's where what students have learned about SEL and they gain more context and they use it through application, right? Students practice these SEL skills as they learn in different academic subjects. And then they reflect on their own experiences and they make connections to what they're learning and communicate, and collaborate with their classmates and with their teachers. So I do want to hone in for just a couple of minutes on that third stool leg there. So we can then break that down in terms of three main ideas. So that first being this idea of student-centered approaches. So educators really do foster the student-centered approaches when they're taking action to ensure that all students feel that sense of belonging in classrooms, that students feel like they can grow and be successful, and that work is truly meaningful to them. So teachers do this in many ways, but very much through holding high expectations, using culturally responsive teaching practices, really counteracting stereotype threat, framing mistakes as a part of the learning process, taking that constructive approach there, and valuing students' ideas and choices in their classrooms. And so these examples are very much grounded in research, particularly around the building of academic mindsets. So there's been a great deal of work out of the University of Chicago, University of Virginia, Stanford, have done a great deal of work in terms of the ways and the roles that students' academic efficacy, student identity, their mindset, their own academic self-concept, um, the ways that they are experiencing school, how they relate, I'm sorry, to their learning as well as their achievement. So we know that strong relationships between academic self-concept and motivation and persistence, for example, very much, right, relate to subsequent achievement. And SEL can serve as a vehicle for that. The second component here is thinking about the alignment of SEL with academic objectives and benchmarks. So educators can align SEL and academic benchmarks when they're really weaving together the objectives, right? So for example, if I'm a social studies teacher and I'm teaching a lesson that focuses on perspective taking, or I'm a science teacher and really thinking about the science lesson that also takes aim at collaborating productively, like in a lab, for example, with a group, and really persisting through those challenges. That's where we really see a nice marriage there between SEL and academic objectives. And then the third element here is really when educators are using what we call interactive pedagogy, right? So when they actively involve students in making meaning of academic content. And they're doing this through really rich classroom discussions, collaborative learning styles, project-based learning. Students practice SEL as they form questions, as they're exploring different projects and organizing and collaborating together, when they're reacting to challenges and solving problems together, and then ultimately sharing their work with one another and engaging in really constructive dialogue and feedback. So, when this is done thoughtfully and really also with a lens towards equity, we see the use of interactive pedagogy and more specifically inquiry-based approaches, really providing robust and consistent opportunities for learning for students, right? And then what's embedded in that is the demonstration of those social emotional learning skills that they're acquiring along the way. So really also just calling out the fact that teachers play a really important role in supporting students' mindsets, their beliefs about themselves, about their learning, and really modeling and supporting productive struggle. I like to call it joyful grappling, right, with content. And teachers can send that message, right, that struggling with the concept is a part of how we learn. It's a part of the learning process. And then again, we also see a lot of good alignment with SEL and objectives, and we're really aiming to reach both objectives in the same lesson. So we are not adding more. It's not an add-on to a teacher's plate. We're really seeing SEL very much kind of baked into the lesson and into the stated objectives. And then, of course, we have this interactive instructional practice model where students are really doing the cognitive lift and they're doing it together in a truly safe space. So we're gonna unpack these a little bit more today in our conversation with our panelists as well. I did want to just share a couple of what I call them kind of look fors and essential questions to be asking when we are observing, right, these classrooms and these practices and looking for the integration of SEL into academic instruction. This is also an opportunity to think about, look down at what you reflected on in the inclusive welcome, right? How do you know this is happening? So some questions, right? Like, do we see SEL standards or goals that are clearly embedded in learning? I have been in a variety of classrooms, math, science, ELA, where there is a SWABAT benchmark, and underneath there's a goal that specifically speaks to a core competency that would be addressed, for example, in that benchmark. So thinking about relationship skills or responsible decision making. Really asking, are students regularly sharing their perspectives, right, on how the competencies are connected to what they're learning and how they're using them? Are there moments for both self-reflection and group reflection within the lesson? Is pretty critical to see here. That third, what are we seeing from the teachers in terms of how they're actively engaging students in the co-construction, right, of knowledge and the work ahead? Oftentimes with this, we'll see that, we hear more student talk than teacher talk. And that's like also a nice look for in this type of model, particularly when we're thinking about interactive pedagogy. And then also thinking about, teachers' use of intentional strategies for fostering student ownership. So do students feel agentic in the classroom, and do they feel like they have the voice in the lesson, right, to kind of, again, share perspectives and experiences. So hopefully leaving just a little bit, some nice guiding questions to take back with you. So that is a very quick research overview and kind of framing on how we think about systemic SEL and its integration into academic instruction. And so with that, again, I have the joy to share the screen with two colleagues and collaborators here. Dr. Joseph Pullman is the Associate Dean of Research in the School of Education and Professor of Educational Psychology and Learning Sciences in the School of Ed at University of Colorado Boulder. Dr. Pullman's research examines how people learn science and history through inquiry, so both in schools and then also in community-based out-of-school programs. He designs and studies project-based learning environments for youth with an important goal of his research to inform the design of learning environments that involve young people with really powerful tools for democratic participation in order to better prepare them as citizens. And Dr. Sarah Rim Kaufman is the Commonwealth Professor of Education at the University of Virginia. She has spent 20 years studying social emotional learning and teaching students about learning and development. Her research examines the role of social and emotional learning plays in elementary and middle school classrooms with the goal of using evidence to improve the quality of schooling experiences for teachers and students. So thank you both for joining us today. Really looking forward to hearing all thoughts and insights. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. The first question is to you both. However, Joe, I think I'm going to have you spearhead us.
Okay.
What do you say to an educator who says, I cannot do SEL. It is yet another thing on my plate. I don't have time. I have a packed curriculum. I cannot fit it in. What would be your response to that educator?
My first part of my response is that whether you're thinking about it or not, you're already doing it. And by that, I mean you're implicitly participating in and facilitating social and emotional learning, even if you're not explicitly planning how you're doing so. And with that in mind, I would argue that you can actually do things better that you're already trying to do. Things like engagement, greater equity, deeper learning that is situated and meaningful to the students. These all, by integrating SEL and doing it mindfully instead of accidentally, I believe you can do that. So it's worthwhile to think about how you're doing it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Sarah, anything you would add?
Sure, I really like that answer. And what I would add to that is children and youth are always learning from the people around them. So the question is, are you intentional about that, and are you fully aware of that or not, in the way that you're modeling behavior? I think, for example, many aspects of SEL, for example, shared norms in the beginning of the year, like a charter or shared rules, those activities that are often considered SEL activities operate in ways that prevent problems down the road. And so, in essence, it can be very proactive as opposed to reactive.
Mm.
And then I'll close with this idea that here's what I often talk about with educators is I'll say, imagine that you're rolling out this new math lesson. What is it the students will need to be able to do for this lesson to go well? Do they need to listen to each other and take turns with others? Do they need to manage feelings of anxiety or competition while simultaneously engaging in work? What are some of the skills that they need to bring to the table before they can do this lesson?
Oh, wonderful. I appreciate both of those answers because that is a very common question, I think,
It
that
is.
often comes up. And one of the pieces also that I heard from both of you is, and again, this is why we believe it's like systemic, is that you also both touched on the ideas of adult SEL playing a role, right? And educators, not only, I mean, they've learned what good pedagogy is. And they also know that an essence of that is modeling, right? But not only in terms of content, but in their own behaviors. And so
Mhm.
really, really appreciate both of those responses. Um, Sarah, so I am going to ask you the next question, particularly around this idea of principals and school leaders. So this is another common question we get. What can school leaders do to create the conditions that are conducive to integrating SEL into academic learning? How can they
Mhm.
support?
Yeah, it's really an interesting and challenging question. And I think, whenever we talk about school systems, we always use that phrase, but we don't always think about the word system and what it means. And it means when you make a change in one aspect of the system, it's going to have effects in other aspects of the system. And so that when a school leader is prioritizing SEL and the integration of SEL with academic learning, it's going to have a cascading impact on all the other things that are going on in schools. A few things that I've seen that seem to work really well. I've done some work with EL education, and I see the way that they have extra adults in the school to support the project-based learning that they do. That's not always possible, but that is something that some school leaders are able to manage. Also, they build in a crew structure. Every day, there's an amount of time that's set aside for what they call crew. And sometimes I see that they use crew as a way of enhancing the project-based learning that they're doing. And also, they build in academic accountability into their crew structure. And so that sort of supports not only the development of what they call ethical character, but also academic performance. I could go on, but I'll pause and let Joe answer.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things that resonated for me within that, and that expand from it. That um, planning, giving time for teachers to plan for integration of SEL into the academic learning and reflect together, creating that collective culture that Sarah was referring to in some way or another is really important. And I also think it's really useful to focus on relationships both internal and external to the school. Um,
Mm,
and that along, if you're doing that, that'll bring in considerations of equity and culture that SEL integrated into academic learning and instruction can help drive.
really appreciate that last point as well. I'm taking notes. Thank you. So actually, Joe, I'm going to ask to maybe extend some of those thoughts that you just shared. Um,
Mhm.
so in your research, what are the ways that SEL shows up in the designing of these of interactive learning environments? What does that look like? Are there any examples that you can give folks?
Yeah. I wanted to answer this question in part by talking about my journey, where I I see myself as having been accidentally doing SEL throughout much of my career, and then I've gotten more explicit in recent years about it. So um, the throughout my career since the late '90s to the present, I've been engaged in project-based learning initiatives, sort of designing them and implementing them and studying them and trying to improve them. And these have been all, as was mentioned in your kind introduction, you know, trying to be topics that are consequential to students and their communities. Um, and these have gone across disciplines from starting in STEM education, but also history, social studies, English language arts. Um, and it wasn't until 2015 and following when I got involved in this English language arts project that's called Compose Our World, which we refer to in the innovations report. And there's also a book that my colleague Allison Boardman and other colleagues have authored that they might be able to put in the chat related to that. And in that, we put together this framework where we were explicitly doing SEL and the academic project-based learning together. And the framework we used in that we called CAPE, which stands for caring, advocacy, perspective taking, and empathy. And we thought a lot about how to integrate all of those along the way. And importantly, as you just mentioned, we need CAPE for both teachers and their work, and for themselves and others, doing that caring and that advocacy and the perspective taking and empathy, but then also teachers trying to facilitate opportunities for students to do that in these projects. And what that ends up looking like very often in many of my works is inviting students to do projects that are meaningful to them in their personal lives and or their communities or their families, and learning about something that matters to them, but then connecting it to disciplinary and interdisciplinary learning, um, and creating media pieces that try to make the difference to sway others and communicate to others. So a lot of my work has ended up in students creating journalistic pieces, like uh, science news stories or news infographics and so on. And so one example of that is like a kid who, uh, several of our kids did things on topics related to smoking and the effects that has on smoking tobacco, although you also vaping and all those other kinds of things, and the health effects on individuals and communities. And if you do that, you see how in the report, one of the things that really turned me on to this is this notion of transformative SEL that came out in that the first paper 2019 maybe,
Right.
and these notions of curiosity, agency, identity, belonging, and collaborative problem solving. And if a kid, and I'd already been working on those. And so they're curious about the health effects of things like smoking and how it might affect, in some very memorable cases, like my grandfather, who is now experiencing lung cancer. And that drives learning about it. Um, they have the agency to make a choice of a topic, but then also some of the things along the way. They're building an identity where they start to see the science that's in the classroom as important to their own and their communities and people they care about's lives. So it's sort of reframing an identity to be more tied to the academic world in everyday life. And they feel like there's somebody who belongs in that can help them feel like there's somebody who belongs in a science classroom, because the science classroom isn't just some stuff that I can't see how relates to me or other people. And they're integrating this all in a rich, collaborative problem solving atmosphere where challenges emerge, and you've got to negotiate conflicting pieces of information and misinformation and sometimes disinformation. And you put all that stuff together, but you work on it collaboratively with the help of your peers, your teacher, and then you try to create products that will convince others about the importance of a policy issue or personal choices related to science. Hope that wasn't too long.
No, that was unbelievably rich, is what I would call that. Sarah, anything you wanted to add to that idea or those ideas?
The question being,
just the designing of interactive learning environments, like what is the essence of it, or any insights that you have? I just wanted to make sure I opened it up.
Yeah, I do have an example about science learning that I think does apply here, and I'll describe this. So this is work that, and it is also long, so warning label there, a little long, okay. But this is work I did together with Tracy Harkins of Harkins Consulting and Eileen Merritt at Virginia Tech. And we had some observations that came together for us that really pointed to exciting ideas about the integration of academics and social emotional learning. That is that a lot of times in science, and this is based in science classes, a lot of times in science classes, we give kids a lot of information about problems in the world and disasters that are coming, but we do not prepare them to address those concerns. And by doing that, we're creating a lot of anxiety in kids, and that we need to take that next step and help them identify problems and then solutions and work towards those solutions. That was one observation. We also noticed that if you look at the next generation science standards, if you look at the science and engineering practices and you read through those carefully, you'll notice pretty hard to do a lot of those practices unless you've got good SEL skills. So there's things about arguing from evidence and using models, and though they just require effective communication, working collaboratively with others, and a whole set of particularly social skills that are important. So based on that, we created a program called Connect Science that has a lot of themes that are relevant for people who are trying to do project-based learning related to science. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it looks like from the point of view of what a fourth grade classroom might look like. So fourth grade classroom, often they're learning about energy sources, they're learning about electricity, they learn about renewable and non-renewable sources of their electricity, and they learn about electricity production. And so what we did with Connect Science is we kind of created this experience. So in the beginning of the classroom, the students were doing things related to establishing norms for their classroom work to get them ready for some project-based learning that was going to involve independent work and group work that was going to help them connected to the community and create change in the world around them. So they learned about that. Then they learned about what it means to be a citizen. And we made clear everyone is a citizen of the classroom. And that comes with responsibility and it comes with privileges. And so let's talk about what those responsibilities are. Then Connect Science helped develop. So then in this classroom, the kids were learning some basic social emotional skills. One of the big skills that we forget to teach kids is listening. And listening is really hard for kids, for young kids. So when I do this, when I recommend this with kindergarten and first grade, I say, you might need to tell the kids to put their hands on their own mouth while they're listening so that they can really hear what's going on without coming up with their own solution or answer to the problem. It's really challenging to listen. So listening, turn taking, giving feedback, understanding multiple perspectives. These are some basic social skills that sort of are early in the sequence that this classroom did, that these classrooms do with Connect Science. Then the next step is learning about the science. And as kids are learning, there's these opportunities to do these circuits and create these circuits and understand how electrical circuits work, and then understanding renewable and non-renewable resources. Now, understanding non-renewable and renewable resources is such an interesting problem because sometimes it's considered a wicked problem. There isn't one right solution. There's all these things that need to be balanced: economics, practicality, the science. So it's a really challenging problem. So as the kids are learning about renewable and non-renewable resources, you practically see a light bulb go off in their minds where they say, wait a second, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're not going to have enough of these non-renewable resources for the next century. So we better change what we're doing. And then you can see this energy, and the kids want to leap into action. And Connect Science offers a way to guide teachers and students to work together to figure out what problems they've discovered, and then what might be some possible solutions to those problems. And the solutions generally fit into educating others, changing policies at the school, or taking direct action. Then you see the kids sort of working together to develop a solution and then implement that solution. So I'll give you an example from this one classroom. They did an energy fair. They called it an energy carnival. And they did this for the second graders. And their goal was to educate the students and families about this issue of limited non-renewable resources. They showed them what circuits were. They talked about where most of our electricity comes from. And then they gave suggestions for what could be changed in people's homes. Then they even gave a survey at the end to see if their fair, their energy festival, had an impact on its participants. And my favorite survey item is, how long should you keep the refrigerator door open when you're looking for a snack? So it definitely has this kind of fourth grade feel. But this whole process involves this kind of full on engagement and realizing the importance of understanding issues related to energy. And so instead of just saying we got a problem and then moving on to the next unit, these teachers were able to create space and time for kids to use their social emotional skills and engage with their community in a meaningful way to produce a change.
Absolutely beautiful. Like, what great examples from you both. It really actually sparked a couple of points for me. So I feel like Joe and Sarah, from both instances, we see all three components that we label like very much present, right? Whether or not, you give science examples, but this idea also just of the alignment, right? You look at state standards, you look at benchmarks, and you can very much see the SEL that would be needed, those competencies and those skills that have to also be addressed, absolutely in that, right? So we see that alignment of objectives and SEL in academics. And then, of course, both of these examples and grounding in project-based learning is truly interactive pedagogy, right? That is of absolutely students really thinking about not only what the problem is, but I really appreciate the solutions, the solutions focus, because you're absolutely right. Like, if you're just sitting with the problem of practice and identifying it, but then not fostering that curiosity and collaborative problem solving, like what is the outcome here in terms of critical thinking for students. And I want to also touch on the point. It very much felt I I heard these ideas of relevance and being culturally responsive, right, to students in terms of what is top of mind for them? What are they negotiating in the world, right? What are some of their lived experiences that can be harnessed and leveraged, honestly, right, to really make for rich learning opportunities? And again, we think about this idea of the relationships between this idea of responsiveness and relevance and what it does for motivation and what it does, right,
Yeah.
for persistence and engagement. I think, Joe, you specifically called out this idea of engagement that we, of course, know leads to better learning experiences and achievement. So I just wanted to throw that in there as both of you really hit on each one of those points so beautifully. So thank you for that. Um, I did want to segue just slightly, and I am going to open it up to to you both, whoever wants to take the first answer here. But just broadly, right? What does the research tell us in terms of classrooms that create social and psychological experiences, actually, that are productive learning environments for children and for youth? What are some factors to consider there?
Joe, do you want to take it or should I?
Why don't you start, Sarah?
Okay, I'm glad to. I'll start with the simple answer: caring, supportive environments with high yet realistic expectations for academic learning. Again and again, I see in so much of the research, I see the power of high quality teacher-student relationships on student academic and behavioral outcomes. In fact, recently, in the work with EL education, we were looking at how EL education relates to teacher-student caring, and it's one of those things that it relates to an increase in student caring. We see that with a lot of social emotional learning programs, that it actually improves the quality of teacher-student relationships, and that ends up being really important. So one issue and an important distinction I want to make is it's one thing to have a caring classroom, but it is not enough to just have a caring classroom without high expectations for learning and the opportunities for really rich learning experiences. As way of an example, one thing we did recently is we had these 45 responses from middle school students of color about, tell me about a time when someone showed you respect. And in middle school, respect is a way of showing caring. So when a teacher is showing you respect, it conveys a kind of caring for who you are. And some of the answers were maybe what we might expect. So, for example, students said when they received help when they were in need. So, for example, a substitute was unkind and a principal and a staff member and another student listened and helped the situation. Another that might be predictable would be when the students were appreciated, when they received praise or admiration. Another was when their perspectives were valued. That's not terribly surprising. But another one that came up among these students of color is when their learning and growth was prioritized. So when teachers really cared about the students' learning and demonstrated that. So one student said, when my old math teacher gave me harder math because I finished the other math really fast. That was an example of this student explaining how they felt respected as a middle schooler. And that really just stands out in my mind as a message about the integration between social emotional learning and academic learning. What about you,
Thank
Joe?
you. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. That in we see a lot of, it's sort of a given and an understood and expected that active learning is a good thing. And very often there is this persistent problem that even with good intentions of active learning plans and um, uh, project-based learning, problem-based learning, um, and action civics and all kinds of things like that, that many times when implemented, the teacher ends up doing most of the talking. And so I just wanted to name that the research shows us that having the planning, the intention of doing these active collaborative learning kinds of activities is not enough. It's really important to work on ways as individually as educators and more importantly, collectively as collectives of educators to try to help one another get to that lots more student talk, group work, active learning on things that are meaningful and relevant to them. And so I just wanted to add, the research shows us it's hard to implement, but it's also, the research shows us it's worthwhile.
Thank you. Yeah, it's reminding me of the literature on kind of what it means to be a warm demander, right? Like, what does it mean to show warmth and prioritize connection with students while also very much having a very high standard, right? I also like, Sarah, that example you gave with one of that last student response, simply because I feel like even the idea of that's what it means to be seen, right? Or known, like, oh, I need harder work. Like, and my teacher is demonstrating the awareness there, right? She sees me or he sees me, they see me. I just think that's a really kind of nice connection to be made there. This is a very nice segue into a question that's come up for me, and the idea of the role of educators here. So what are the educator, I guess, approaches or mindsets? What are that are needed to engage in this type of inquiry-based learning, interactive pedagogy that really incorporates students' social and emotional development?
I can start if that's
Please.
okay. So to me, the biggest thing is this. It is a non-trivial thing to have a mindset of integration rather than add-on, which is something that Ali, you were saying, and Sarah and I have been saying all along the way. And um, that if you find ways to integrate, then um, it will create a virtuous cycle where the SEL elements help lead to the academic learning elements, and the academic learning helps lead to greater aspects of the SEL. And so an example of that is in a recent paper. I think they could put it in the chat. My colleague Priyanka Parekh and I, we have this article that came out last year called Reconfiguring Science Education Through Caring Human Inquiry and Design with Pets. And I won't take the time to describe this really cool thing, but in a lot of science classrooms, there are animals. There's also, this was done in out of school environment. We're talking about relationships with dogs and cats, and that driving the development of inquiry. We're caring about the pet, realizing I don't understand the ways they experience in the world differently from me, and then learning things, engaging in scientific practices, the NGSS practices again, of question asking, coming up with explanations, so on and so forth. And then you learn more about the science, and the science enables you to care in a new way. So you've got caring leading to learning, and learning leading to better caring, and then you'll work in a collaborative context to do that. So having that mindset that it's not just a chore or another thing, it's a way to do the thing that I already want to do.
Thank you. Sarah, anything else?
Sure. I'll say there's some lessons learned from our initial work on Connect Science. When there was a school leader in place who really cared deeply about the next generation science standards and saw this project-based curriculum as a way of implementing those standards, the paths were much smoother. There were conversations between this district administrator and principals and teachers. And teachers were really supported and were told, you're about to do some really challenging work. And it's consistent with the goals of our district. And you'll be held up as models for that work. That's the kind of thing that I think needs to happen. And so I feel like there's so much pressure on teachers that we really need to be thinking about the supports that are available to them so that they can do this very challenging task. Then when I think about project-based learning, service learning in particular, it occurs to me, and this speaks to a point that Joe mentioned, it's very challenging to give up a bit of control in the classroom and let the students lead. And so when we were developing Connect Science, we really thought a lot about how much choice do students need and what kind of choice matters. And we really wrestled with that, and then how teachers can provide a reasonable amount of choice and still finish things on time. And so it's really a delicate balance, but working with teachers around that was important. The other thing that I've learned from next generation science standards is that, and the professional development that's needed, is when teachers actually experience the science classroom as if they were a student, they're much more able to understand what questions are going to come up from their students and are much more able to do what's needed to be able to integrate SEL into their classroom environment.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to take, we only have a few minutes left. I did want to take a question that we just received. And I feel like we've kind of been touching on it, so I wanted to really call it out. For high school teachers in particular, time is an issue. There's so much to teach, so little time. What are applicable SEL strategies to consider for high school students? And I think I'm just going to have one of you answer. So if someone is chomping at the bit here to share thoughts.
Should I go ahead?
Go for it.
I can go ahead. So I'll say high school is what I know the least about. But that having been said, I'd say the principle of looking at the material and thinking, how can this be used to really understand perspective taking? Looking at the group of students in the classroom and thinking about the material and saying, how will this material be viewed differently by different students? So much like I described for elementary and middle school students, it's the question of, okay, you're about to teach some new lesson and some new material. What are the social emotional tools and some of the opportunities that can be integrated into that lesson?
Beautiful. Absolutely agree. So with that, I think we're going to try to share just a couple of key takeaways. But while we are doing that, I think I would also just offer, a response to that question in the sense of, so I'm a former high school English teacher, and absolutely thinking about SEL in a way that is truly developmentally appropriate requires academic integration, right? It can be integrated into your unit on To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Or Lord of the Flies, if you're looking at ninth grade ELA. Sarah talked about the next gen standards, science standards, right? And how it's there, it's already baked in, honestly, to that model. And then, of course, this idea of interactive pedagogy um, is is a high school classroom in its essence, right? Having students dialogue with one another and really co-construct and collaborate. I think it's all a part of the instruction. So just wanted to make sure we tried to, touch on that response. So again, pick big, if three big takeaways. One, thinking about the ways that SEL creates a very safe academic learning space, right? Where students are a part of a community of learners, where they can make mistakes, they can ask tough questions, they can take those academic risks. And because they have that trust and that sense of belonging, it allows, right, a really strong set of conditions for learning. This was beautifully shared by both of our panelists, this idea of high expectations for students. Um, SEL practice creates the space for students to do more of that, what I like to call cognitive lift, and exercise their own agency. And then lastly, adults matter. Adult SEL matters, right? They're the ones who are really crafting and building the environments of inclusion and belonging, and really, I think, emphasizing and modeling the idea that student voice matters. And because of that, they are then able to create these learning experiences that are high quality and rigorous for students, and supporting students in their own development, as well as their development as a part of a community. So with that, I just want to, again, Joe and Sarah, thank you so much just for all of your thoughts and insights, especially as all of us, we continue to push this work forward. Really appreciate you both.
Thank you.